Steve Crescenzo, and welcome back to my shop. Today I'd like to talk about finishing and achieving a gallery quality finish. Before we start, talk a little bit about safety. Finishing involves sanding, and sanding involves fine dust. So you want to make sure that you have the proper lung protection. You can see I use a powered respirator on mine, but whatever you're doing, you should have a dust collection system and something to protect your lungs, particularly when you're doing woods like walnut and some woods that are slightly allergenic. So one of the most often asked questions I get in displaying my work is how I achieve my finishes. And there's probably as many opinions as there are wood turners on what makes a good finish. I tend to like a finish that is somewhat satin, and but it doesn't sit on the surface, that it actually is down into the wood. So we're going to talk about how to achieve that. There are other options for this. Some turners that are fortunate enough to have a spray booth and spray equipment can spray gloss lacquer and achieve very fine results and artistic results with that. You can use rattle can finishes, acrylic or lacquer, but again, I'm just going to show you how I do it. This is my opinion and what I choose to do. One of the other things you have to consider with your finishes when choosing a finish is what the intended use of the piece is. Will it be used for display? Is it a piece of artwork? Or will it be used for food? Is it functional? And that will somewhat depend on in your choice of finish. Whatever finish you decide to use, though, just make sure it's executed well. And you'll find that that flaws in finishes tend to be, they come out very, they're very obvious to the user. You find that the finer the finish on a piece, the more any defects in the wood or in the underlying wood will be visible. So as you get better at finishing, you'll then have to get better at making sure you get the tool marks and the finishes out. Finally, finishing is a reflection of you and your commitment and your talents as a wood turner. And it's something that will evolve, and again, this is the way I do it, and there's many different ways to do this, but this is my approach. So I mentioned there's different options of finishes. You can put a surface finish on it, something like a spray lacquer or wipe on poly or those types of things, finishes that sit on the surface of the piece. And then there are penetrating finishes like tung oil and those types of finishes that actually penetrate into the wood. Some artistic pieces that I use, I don't put any, I just wax. But that's usually, it's seldom that it doesn't hold up as well as putting an oil finish on it. The first step in finishing is good tool work. So if you ever have displayed your work and people come and look at it in a craft booth or something like that, you'll find that people tend to pick up the piece and hold it. And you can tell that if it's a pleasing shape, they'll take it, they'll hold it in their hands. You can almost see the look on their face as they feel it and they feel particularly the bottom and look at the top. And you should be doing the same thing. If the wood doesn't have a pleasing shape to you, or as you feel it, it's not smooth, you're not going to be able to get a good finish on it. So, starts with good tool work. You have to remember that sandpaper is not a shaping tool, it's a finishing tool. But realize that there are times, in some very difficult woods, some crotch woods, some burls, and just some woods that give you aggravation, that you will have to resort to sanding in order to get your final shaping done. But in general, you should try to use good tool work to minimize the amount of sanding you have to do. You see some turners talk about, well, I don't have to start sanding until 400. Well, that may be well and good, but don't trap yourself into that corner. If it takes 80 grit to get it sanded correctly, then use 80 grit to get it done. But just don't trap yourself into the corner thinking that you have to start with a very fine sandpaper in order to get it done. There are turners that can get it, and there are some times where the finish coming off the tool is just fine, but in general you want you have to sand to get the results. So the other thing is to sand through each of the grits. I like to start at 120. There are times when I have some tear out or some problem areas that I have to start lower than that, but typically I'll start at 120 and I'll go to 120, 220, 320 and end at 400 if it's wood. If it's some of the acrylic work that I do, that's a whole different story. Then you're going up to 2,000 or more with wet sanding and polishing that you have to do. But with wood, I usually stop at 400, and what I find is if you go, because I'm using a penetrating finish, if I go much more than 400, I'd start burnishing the surface of the wood, and it makes it so the finish doesn't go in evenly. So I'll stop it. Typically what I'll do is I'll go through 120, and then I'll go to 220, and I use a combination of a drill with a sanding pad on it, and you notice that I tend to do this very slowly. There's no sense in overheating your sandpaper. All it does is make it doesn't last as long. So lathe should be turning very slowly when you're sanding with the drill, and hand sanding also. If the sandpaper gets too hot for you to hold, then you're turning too fast on it. Once I get to 220, I'll tend to take denatured alcohol. Just take some denatured alcohol and just put on a paper towel, and I'll wipe down the piece. And that'll give me an idea of what's going on with what it's going to look like. But it also will tell me, it'll highlight any defects or any scratches, or if there's tear out or if it's not smooth. That'll tend to tell me what I'm doing. I'll do the front and the back and just go through it. Determining whether you have a good enough finish on here is a combination of both your eyes looking at it, but use your hands also to run through there. And your hands will be one of your better indicators, and that's how your customers are going to judge this work as well. All right. If I go through 220 and it's all smooth and I don't see any defects, I'll move on to 320 and to 400. If I see something on the 220 that after wiping it with the denatured alcohol that I'm not happy with, I'll go back to 120 and do it again. And in some cases, you might feel a ridge, and you might have to go back and pick up a tool and go back in there to get that ridge out. But in general, that's the process I'll go through, and to get it done, again, I'll stop at 400 when I go through. So I'm going to take this bowl off the lathe. I'm going to finish the foot, and then we'll come back when we're ready to put a finish on it. So I've taken the bowl, I've finished the base using the vacuum chuck, and I did, after putting the denatured alcohol on it, I did denib it with a white scratch spray pad just to make sure that any grain that was raised on it is off, and then wiped it down again. And now I'm just going to put the finish on. I tend to use General Finishes Seal-A-Cell, which is a penetrating oil that goes on it, and the method I use is I put it on, I coat it liberally, I keep putting it on until it stops absorbing it, I let it sit for about 20 minutes and then wipe off any excess, and then let it dry. So just a word of caution about using any type of oil finish. Just need to make sure that you dispose of your rags properly. I put mine in a fireproof can as soon as I finish to make sure that there's not a spontaneous combustion hazard with that. So my method is I just take this, I just use plain paper towels. And I'll just coat the piece front and back. And you can see the really pretty grain in that curly walnut. Alright, so we'll come back in about 15-20 minutes. I'm just going to keep coating this, and we'll come back and do a final wipe down and then let it dry. Alright, so we've let this, kept reapplying it till it stopped taking finish. It's had a chance to soak in, and as we talked before, this is not a surface finish. This is a penetrating finish. So what I do is I'll just take a clean towel and just wipe off what's on the surface. Off my hands, and then one last I just use these little painter's points to just elevate it a little bit so it has a chance to dry without. And I'll give that about 48 hours, and then we'll go on to the next step, which we'll just buff it out. So this is the walnut bowl after coating it with seal cell and letting it sit for about 2 days to let the finish get hard. And what I would normally do at this point is I would normally go to the Beal buffing system and buff it out. You may know the Beal system has 3 different grades. It has a Tripoli, which is the coarsest of the polishing compounds, white diamond, which is the finer, and then it finishes with the carnauba wax. When I do this, I also use a last step, which is just a wheel that has nothing on it that I just use to buff it out. But with this walnut being so dark and somewhat open grain, I hesitate to buff with the white diamond, which is where I would normally start. If you've done a good job with your finishing and your sanding, you don't need to use the Tripoli, or I don't use the Tripoli. I find that it actually tends to, it will go through some finishes if you're not careful, or it gets too hot. I normally start with the white diamond if I'm using the buffing system, but again with this walnut, because it is so dark and somewhat an open grain, I worry that the white powder will get into the grain. So instead I'm going to take this back over to the lathe, put on the vacuum chuck, and just buff it out a little bit to get some of the nibs off it with either a steel wool or with a white buffing pad. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to take this, I'm going to put it on the vacuum chuck. I'm not going to worry about getting it accurately centered. All I do is I just take this on here, I give it a spin, I just look at it by eye, and if it's close I just go ahead and do it, and I will turn on the vacuum pump. I'm going to use just a low speed, and I'll probably just hit it with Quado steel wool, and then take the white Scotch-Brite pad after that, and just again all I'm trying to do is just break down any of the nibs that might have formed from raising the grain when I put the finish on it, and also just to even it out just a bit if it needs it. And I'll just turn it over and do the same thing on the back side. Take this over and proceed to buffing. Alright, so just, I'm not going to use the white diamond on the walnut bowl, but I do have another bowl here that is close to being finished here. This is just a maple bowl with some burl in it, and I'm just going to run through the white diamond on this one so you can see the process. One of the mistakes people make with the wheel buffing system is that they use too much of the material on there. You don't need much to make it work. I typically give it about 3 or 4 seconds of just touching this onto the wheel to make it work, and then go ahead and buff it. So that's the process with the white diamond, and the key is to just make sure you keep the bulb moving when you have it on the wheel. I will go back and do the back side of that as well. But I'm going to go ahead and just switch to the carnauba wax, and we'll put that finish on there as well. So I've just given that a buffing with the carnauba wax, and like I said, what I do, one last step, is I'll go ahead and I have a wheel that is just has nothing on it, and I find that I like the luster that it gives it after I put the wax on. It just gives it a little bit more of a buff. And that's the finish. As I said, this is what I prefer for a number of my pieces. I call it a soft satin finish. It's got a little bit of gloss to it, but it's not mirror finish like you'd get with a lacquer. But it does tend to highlight the grain and without a lot of reflection. We'll post some pictures of this at the end of the video, some close-ups of the finished product so you can see it. Again, this is the way I do it. You can, as any number of turners you talk to will have their own methods for doing it, but this is what I do and what works for me. But it's well worth the effort you put in it to take this time, and again, to just hold it and have it pleasing in your hands, and to feel, and as well as to look at.